Can you hear the rain? Rainy Saturday. What's a guy to do except shoot a booktube video? Hey everyone, here are my March book reviews. 10 books in March, that's a lot, so I'll try to be as succinct as possible. As always, I'll group these by genre, put chapters below with my book of the month last. Although there were some very strong contenders for book of the month, it was really a tough decision. Starting with the first book that I'm going to talk about, that is Hiroshima by John Hersey. So Hiroshima is a work of nonfiction. It was originally published in 1946. It did win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature, and this is basically Hersey interviewing 6 survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima. And I find historical stories of this type the best when it's kind of personal stories like this, rather than just kind of here's the history, here's what happened, but the stories that zoom in and talk about the personal stories of different people. And Hersey interviewed 6 survivors of the Hiroshima bombing, and he took a very journalistic approach, not just in his prose, which frankly I wish would have been maybe a little richer, but it was very journalistic. But when I say journalistic approach, kind of like the way that journalism used to be, where the journalist would just present the story and wouldn't necessarily pick a side. You know, for something like this, you could very well take the slant of evil Americans hurt all these people with the bombing, or you could take the other slant that says, you know, that thousands died so that would save millions in future battles. He didn't do any of that. He just told the story of 6 survivors of Hiroshima. He talked about what happened right before, during the events, and afterwards. And then one of the great things of this text, reading this in 2026, is in the 1980s, he followed up and filled in the gaps of the 40 years between the bombing and when he, you know, reached out and searched out these individuals, kind of gave their life stories and how this event impacted them, how they were able to move on, and what their life's work were often influenced by the events of the bombing of Hiroshima. It was a really impactful text, and I really enjoyed reading it, although enjoy is probably not the best term, but I thought it was a great read. I did spend a day in Hiroshima a couple years ago, and it was one of the most impactful experiences, and I think that enhanced this book for me, was just being able to visualize things so well, just from walking the streets around the area where the bombing happened and spending time at the Peace Museum, which was such an impactful and personal experience for me, added a lot. But I think that one of the great things about this, besides just the personal tale, is it's short, and I think it really packs a punch, and it's a very, very great book, and I can recommend it to just about anybody that is interested in reading about kind of some personal stories coming out of the bombing of Hiroshima during World War II. Another great one I read this month was The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. This is a classic that I actually read in school. I don't remember what grade I was in when I read this, but I remember the character names, Wang Lung and his wife Olan, and I remember my teenage friends and me just kind of scoffing at, oh, the land, the connection to the land that Wang Lung had. And for me, that was, as an adult, one of the best things about this. I really loved that kind of connection that this main character had to the land. Wang Lung is a Chinese farmer, and this is a story of him kind of dealing with perseverance and dealing with famine and drought, and even dealing with perseverance in times of abundance when things are going well for him. And the story, in many ways, this is kind of one of the biggest compliments I could give to any writer, is it reminded me of Steinbeck. Not in the writing style. I think Pearl S. Buck's writing style is maybe a bit more direct than Steinbeck's, but in just kind of this theme of this everyday person. You know, we're following a very poor farmer, especially at the beginning, and dealing with perseverance. And that's something that I've enjoyed in a lot of works by John Steinbeck, one of my favorite authors. And Pearl S. Buck does just a masterful job for this. And you follow basically Wang Lung's entire life. And it's a very great story. I really enjoyed reading it. And the only knock I had on this is kind of towards the end. I felt it went on just a little too long in kind of the later years of this character, but I really love just following his story. It was one of those engrossing stories that you just get hooked into it early on, and it just is compelling from beginning to end. So quick thanks to my friend Tori over at Tori Talks. She sent this to me, and I'm really glad she did because I really enjoyed my time with The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. I actually finished 2 audiobooks this month. Both of them were in the science fiction genre, coincidentally. Let's start with Sea of Rust by Robert Cargill. This is a post-apocalyptic story that has been on my radar for a while. I don't remember how it got on my radar, but this is a story. It's kind of a typical post-apocalyptic story. We got a kind of almost desert landscape because of what had happened. It's set in the Midwest, and the Sea of Rust is basically how the Midwest has become a desert, and Rust has to do also with kind of a lot of the machines and robots and things that litter this landscape. And we're following a character who is just trying to survive. Well, the twist in Sea of Rust is this isn't a human character trying to survive, it's a robot character trying to survive. As you see that there's a lot of infighting between robots and AIs for supremacy and things like that because humanity's been wiped out. So that alone is a really, really great hook for me, and I thought it was pretty well done. My only kind of big thing I didn't like about Sea of Rust was that the robots, they all kind of felt human. And I'm not the most well-read in science fiction. I am working on it, and I continue to read more and more. And one of the things that I really appreciate is I love when an author shows you alien life of any kind, and a robot would be an alien life. It's not a human. And they feel truly alien. They feel truly different. Well, the main character here and most of the kind of supporting cast, they felt pretty much they could have been humans instead of robots. So that aside, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a good story. It wasn't a really long story based on just like the length of the audiobook, but I did enjoy listening to Sea of Rust and can definitely recommend it for people that, want a story kind of like that in a post-apocalyptic setting. So the other science fiction audiobook that I listened to was Darth Plagueis by James Luceno. This was a surprise because this is probably a top 5 Star Wars novel that I've read. I think I've read 25 novels. I compiled a list a while back, and this is a top 5 for me. In many ways, this could have been called The Rise of Darth Sidious, and I liked that aspect of it a lot. So Darth Plagueis is a character you hear mentioned in the episode 3 movie about Darth Plagueis the Wise, and he experimented on midichlorians and tried to basically live forever. And this is kind of his story, but more of the story, I think if you added up page count, there's more of the Palpatine storyline in here than the Plagueis storyline, and that's where I found the story so interesting, because Plagueis meets a young Palpatine and sees something in him that he thinks he can cultivate into his apprentice as a Sith Lord. And you see kind of early Palpatine, who's very politically savvy, and we know from the movies and these stories how that's how he ends up taking power, is through, political machinations, playing both sides of different political conflicts. And you see kind of the early stages of this character, and you see early on how he's also very ruthless already. And you kind of see him grow into the big Dark Lord that he became. Luceno has another book called Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader. This could have been called Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Sidious, because really that's what the story was about. I did find Plagueis' story very interesting, especially early on, how you see how he ascends from apprentice to being the master of the rule of 2, the Sith. And I liked that aspect of it, but I really enjoyed the just kind of the rise of Darth Sidious. And this starts from decades before we see anything in the movies, and it finishes up basically playing out all the events of the first movie from different points of view, mainly Sidious and Plagueis. But I really enjoyed it, and the audiobook's great. These Star Wars audiobooks are fantastic. They have great production values, great narrators, great sound effects, and they put soundtrack in there at times too. So I really enjoyed my time with Darth Plagueis by James Luceno. A Dark and Hungry God Arises is the third book in the Gap cycle, the subtitle being The Gap into Power. And I was initially really excited for this one. This is the third of the 5 books in the Gap cycle. And the first book was very much a character study of 3 characters. And then the second book started to expand into what this is, the series is a kind of a grimdark space opera. And we kind of got that expansion in character in the second book. Well, in here we got it in point of view. So I was initially really excited for that because right away we get a brand new point of view of a character that was a bit of an enigma and very interesting to me that we met at the end of the second book. And I was so excited that we're expanding and this is going to be a grand space opera. Until I wasn't, because I felt that the point of views, while they expanded the breadth of the scale of this story, it didn't advance the story at all. The main character from the first 2 books, we don't see her on the page for 180 pages, and then we barely see her. But even with all these point of views, there's not a lot of forward motion for the plot whatsoever. It just kind of sat there. And there were a lot of just kind of circular conversations with people. And you get all of these point of views that are unreliable narrators. So they're having these conversations with people while they're thinking one thing and saying another thing. And they're always trying to manipulate each other. And to be honest, I was kind of bored through a lot of this. I was waiting for something interesting to happen. And overall, this book was a bit of a letdown until the last 120 to 150 pages where, the story actually went somewhere. And we got some characters thrown together that weren't likely to be predicted to be thrown together and having to cooperate. And it was really interesting. And the ending, except for the last chapter, was phenomenal. So it kind of salvaged the book for me. But that said, it might be my least favorite of the 3 books. It's definitely, the second book is definitely my favorite. But it got little bit bloated. And one of the knocks I've heard about Donaldson in his career is that the further he got into his career, the more bloated his books became. And I hope that's not the case with this series because books 4 and 5 are even bigger than this one. This was the longest one of the 3 so far at about 550 pages. Each book adds about 100 pages. And I hope that the story progresses rather than just stagnates because honestly, I felt like the author was wasting my time for a lot of this. So I'm not going to be doing a full book review on this one. I did shoot about a 5-minute video of my thoughts for this one for a wrap-up video when I do finish the Gap cycle. So if you've been following those videos, just be patient. I am going to read the 5 books in the first 5 months of the year. So my wrap-up video will be kind of end of May, early June for the entire Gap cycle series. But I had higher hopes and hope that the trajectory of the series, which just went down with this book, bounces back up for the final 2 installments. On to the fantasy genre, and I'm going to talk about The Treason of Isengard, which is the 7th book in the history of Middle-earth. This is the omnibus collection. This has 4 of the 12 installments in that. So in addition to being volume 7 in the history of Middle-earth, The Treason of Isengard is also the second volume, also subtitled The History of the Lord of the Rings. But that's kind of a misnomer. In many ways, it should be called The History of the Writing of the Lord of the Rings, because that's what these 2 volumes have done. For me, I've loved them. They're not for everybody. If you are interested in seeing kind of how the sausage is made, how the story evolved, how Tolkien's writing evolved, how he changed things along the way in The Lord of the Rings, these books are for you. Volume 6 and 7, The Return of the Shadow, and The Treason of Isengard. You'll absolutely have a great time with them as I did. I really love seeing the evolution of the story. I love seeing how things change. I love seeing how much he knew the full story, kind of realized in his head, and how much was not in there yet. How much he just kind of discovered as he wrote. He's very much, to use the gardener and the architect comparisons as an author, he's very much a gardener, where so much that he wrote he kind of discovered along the way, and he may write out a outline of things that are going to happen, and then things change along the way. For a long time, for instance, Boromir did not die early in his story, end of his story, but early in the series. The second volume of this history of the Lord of the Rings, it kind of starts at Rivendell and it takes us partway through the Two Towers, but it does take Sam and Frodo's story pretty much to the end. So he does show you a lot of the kind of the scope of the whole thing, but a lot of it is the focus of what happened because he was really unsure what he was going to do, like which characters were going to pair up. I mean, he doesn't even call Aragorn all the time until kind of the end of this volume. He had several different names along the way. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I think you'll love the Treason of Isengard. I certainly did, and I look forward to continuing with the next one, which is called The War of the Ring. So that'll be the next installment of that I'll probably read later this year. All right, the next two works in the fantasy genre I can review together because they are the second and third books of a series, a trilogy. The series is The Legends of the Rift War by Raymond E. Feist, and I read the second installment, which is Murder in LaMut by Feist and Joel Rosenberg, and I read the third installment, Jimmy the Hand, which he co-wrote with S.M. Stirling. All three of these books he co-wrote with different authors. And to Feist's credit, I think that most of it is kind of seamless. There's a little bit in the collaboration with Rosenberg that I'll talk about that didn't seem seamless. But to talk about these separately, Murder in LaMut, I called it LaMut, but they're called Lamutians in the story, so I guess it's LaMut. Anyway, he wrote this with Joel Rosenberg, and Rosenberg was a very popular fantasy author, I think primarily in the 1980s. I don't think I've read anything solo by him. But in this story, we get kind of a Victorian manor murder mystery, which is very interesting to see this thing in a fantasy setting. Although the murder doesn't happen till very late in the book, but what you get is basically you have three mercenaries they're hired out to a job that takes us to LaMut, and they're in the castle with the nobles, and then they're snowed in. And they're out of their element because they're dealing with political entities, and they're just warriors for hire. But because of a sequence of events, they have to kind of be the ones that investigate this murder. And a lot of times throughout this, because they are mercenaries, they're the only people that can be impartial in this manner in these things that are going on. So it played out like that. So as a fan of that kind of thing, old school Agatha Christie and things like that, I really liked that aspect of it. The writing was a little disjunct, though. It started off with kind of a very stylized story. Like the first line was, it was a dark and stormy night, and there was kind of this snarky narrative voice for a lot of chapters. And then that kind of narrative voice was toned down for a long time, and then it kind of resurfaced at the end. So I wonder if Rosenberg wrote the first few chapters and then Feist took over and they traded back and forth like that, because I didn't feel the writing was as seamless in his other collaborations that I've seen with William Fortune, the one with S.M. Stirling, and of course the trilogy that he co-wrote with Janny Wirtz. I didn't feel the writing was as seamless in this one, but I enjoyed this one. If you're into that kind of story, it's not a big story, it's a very self-contained story, but I enjoyed my time. I love this world, and I enjoyed the story, and the three main protagonists were very, very unique characters, and I enjoyed Murder in LaMut. So Jimmy the Hand is the one I was most looking forward to in this series, because as I was thinking about this, I was thinking he's probably my favorite character in the original Rift War series, but no, he is my favorite character in the original Rift War series. This kind of street urchin thief that's really, really good, just seeing him as king of the streets and able to just thrive at such a young age. I love competent characters in any setting, but Jimmy the Hand is a very memorable one from the Rift War. So I was really excited because this is set between books 1 and 2 of the original Rift War saga, after Magician, before Silverthorn. So I was excited for this, but they took Jimmy the Hand out of Krondor. They took him out of the city for a lot of this, and that's kind of where he thrives. Initially, it was interesting because you saw him struggle in a setting that he's not kind of king of his own domain. He's struggling in these kind of rural and farm settings and things like that. So that was initially interesting, until kind of the story just kept going on and you realize, I want to see Jimmy back in the city again. And unfortunately, the story itself progress through a great series of plot conveniences. And that was disappointing because it was just one thing after another that, oh, this just happened to happen, so now we're here. And, oh, and then this thing happened to happen, so that has to move us here. And we got to the final story points, what the big story was telling, and you realize that this didn't really have to be a Jimmy the Hand story. It could have been any protagonist in the center of this. So that was a bit disappointing, and this is probably my least favorite of the three, which is sad to me because I love this character so much. But I did enjoy the Legends of the Rift War series. I think Honor to Enemy, the first book that he wrote with William Fortune, is the best of the three. But I do love this world. I do love Feist writing, and I will be continuing the Rift War cycle hopefully soon. I have the first two books of the Conclave of Shadows trilogy on the shelf. As soon as I pick up the third one, I'll probably start that series. So hopefully later in the year, I'll be reading more in this Rift War cycle by Raymond E. Feist. Hero in the Shadows by David Gemmell was the 9th book in the Draenei Saga. There are 11 books in the Draenei Saga, plus 2 prequels. And I was so excited for this because this is the third and kind of final Waylander book. And there are 3 main protagonists in the Draenei Saga. We get Druss, we meet in the first book, Waylander, who we meet in the third book, and then Skilgannon, who I'll meet in the 10th book when I pick that one up later this month. But Hero in the Shadows is the third and final installment that has Waylander. And in many ways, these 3 books can serve as kind of a Waylander trilogy. And they are standalones, and they are kind of Waylander in different stages of his life. He does something here that he did before very well, but I think it's done even a little better here in taking an aging warrior who is kind of ready for retirement and ready to not be involved in things and have them forced back into various events. He first did this, Gemmell first did this with Druss in the first book, Legend. And we saw this ancient Druss who's back for one more battle. While Waylander is trying to get out of the game, he's trying to just be retired, but he's thrown into this story. And he's older, he's still very competent, but he's a different man than you knew in the first 2 books. But he's also still kind of fighting the demons of his past. And I love the Waylander books the most out of all the Draenei Saga because I think the character is so much more multi-layered than a lot of the other characters, the protagonists in the story. And this was a great one. I found myself kind of emotional at the end, and it's typical Gemmell, consistent from beginning to end, pacing, plotting, story payoff at the end is there. Just another great installment by Gemmell. I'm getting close. I have 2 more in the main series and then 2 more prequels, and I look forward to doing a big Gemmell video and talking about the Draenei Saga, but I really enjoyed Hero in the Shadows. My book of the month was The Black Echo by Michael Connelly. This is Connelly's debut. This was a reread, and this was the start of a long-term project I'm going to be doing, where I'm going to be rereading all of Connelly's works. I'm going to do dual reviews, so I'll read 2 books and then do a review of the 2 books together. So I'll be reading The Black Ice this month and talking about these 2 books. So this kind of surprised me. I didn't expect this first book to be as strong as his later books. But I forgot, it's Connelly. I've said for years that he's the most consistently great author that I've read. His ceiling is maybe not as high as some other authors, but his floor is higher than probably anybody else I've ever read. And this is maybe not S-tier Connelly, but it's pretty close, and it's remarkable because it's his first book. It's a little rough around the edges. You know, the kind of writing style that Connelly develops through his career is very efficient. And it's a little less efficient here, but I kind of liked it a little bit more at times because it was maybe a little bit more descriptive than what he eventually becomes. But I enjoyed that part of it. And I think it was maybe a little bit more important in this book because he had to do a little bit more groundwork for our main character, Harry Bosch. Connelly's first book, Harry Bosch's first book. Anytime you have a character that, I mean, I don't think he could have predicted he'd be writing 25 of these, and there's another Bosch book coming out later this year. But anytime you have kind of these potential series where you have a main character, you have to lay some groundwork for that character. And Connelly does it very intelligently here because he wraps it up within kind of the story within The Black Echo. The story is essentially that a body is found in one of these underground tunnels in LA, and it turns out that it's one of Harry's people that he served with in the Vietnam War. So we get a lot of his backstory as a Vietnam veteran. You get quite a bit of his backstory growing up. You also get the story of him as kind of a maverick within the LAPD, because he starts this story as being banished to the Hollywood division, which is kind of the dregs of the LAPD, despite just catching a major serial killer. But he's banished because they can't fire him, because he kind of painted outside the lines in catching this serial killer and perhaps broke the law in catching this villain. That happens before, but he lays the groundwork for this character and what this character is all about. And Harry doesn't care that he's banished to Hollywood, because he just wants to solve cases. And you see kind of that dogged pursuit of this case, despite various entities within the LAPD kind of thwarting his efforts. And it's typical Connelly, and the plotting is just perfect. But again, I loved kind of this rough around the edges writing style that's not as polished as later. And it worked really well for this first book. So my book of the month was the debut by one of my favorite authors, Michael Connelly. Book of the month, The Black Echo, for March 2026. So I think that was pretty succinct for 10 reviews. I hope you didn't want too much more out of all of these. I wanted to try to go quick and keep this under a half hour, and I think I was successful at that. But this was a great month. I'd love to hear the best thing that you read in March. And of course, if you read any of these books, I'd love to talk with you in the comments section below. Just please label any spoilers for people that haven't read them. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.